Forget the perfectly pristine historical dramas you see on TV. We're diving straight into the grueling, unsanitary, but incredibly resilient reality of everyday life in colonial America. In this explainer, we're going to completely shatter those romanticized myths of the 1700s and look at what it literally took to survive.
Right off the bat, let's just imagine you've woken up in the 18th century, stripped of every single modern comfort you take for granted. No electricity, no running water, and as we'll find out, a whole lot of unexpected smells. Ask yourself, would you genuinely have the grit to make it to sundown?
Here is our colonial survival guide for today. We're going to map this all out, starting with waking up in colonial America, moving into the stench and sanitation crisis, a life of backbreaking labor, social classes and city life, medicine, winter and survival, and finishing up with how all this hardship forged the American character.
Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, Waking Up in Colonial America, specifically the cold, hard morning.
The contrast between then and now is just staggering. I mean, your modern morning is essentially a luxury resort compared to the colonial reality. Imagine waking up with a severely aching back on a sagging rope frame that's just stuffed with prickly straw. You've got zero glass windows, mostly because glass costs more than a lot of people earned in an entire year. Your feet hit a freezing, packed dirt floor. And your breakfast? It's plain cornmeal mush cooked over a dangerous open fire that someone had to stay up and keep alive all night long.
And when it comes to your wardrobe, there's a really crucial number you have to wrap your head around. 1. That is exactly how many sets of everyday clothes the average colonist owned. You wore it working, you wore it sleeping, and you kept wearing it until it literally fell apart. The fabric was rough, scratchy wool or linen, and because of this, absolutely everyone smelled heavily of wood smoke, sweat, and unwashed bodies. It was basically just the background noise of colonial life.
Which brings us right to Section 2, the stench and sanitation crisis, or living close to nature and waste.
If you thought the morning air inside was rough, wait until you realize what your house is made of. Most likely, it's a tiny 1- or 2-room house built using a technique called wattle and daub. Yes, that means your walls are quite literally plastered with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. It dried hard and kept the weather out, sure, but you're sharing this incredibly tight, zero-privacy dung house with up to 10 other people.
Now, if you were living in a crowded city rather than a farm, you'd have to constantly listen for one specific desperate warning cry from above. Gardy-loo. That was the signal that someone was about to dump the contents of their indoor chamber pot straight out of a second-story window. It landed directly in the unpaved streets below, mixing with massive amounts of animal waste, turning the roads into muddy rivers of absolute filth.
So staying clean wasn't just difficult. People actually feared it. Doctors genuinely believed that a layer of dirt and natural oils on your skin protected you from disease. When people did wash, they used this incredibly harsh soap made from animal fat and lye, which could easily cause chemical burns. And since full-body baths were seen as dangerous and immoral, lice were just everywhere. Even George Washington complained about his expensive wigs being completely infested with head lice. Worse yet, since outhouses were moved manually, waste frequently contaminated the well water, sparking horrific and deadly outbreaks of dysentery and cholera.
Okay, so you're awake, you've survived the sanitation situation, which brings us to Section 3, a life of backbreaking labor. Literally earning your survival.
Think about something as simple as getting dressed. If you needed a new shirt, there were absolutely no shortcuts. Women would spend weeks laboring over a spinning wheel, needing incredible hypnotic precision just to produce the continuous thread from raw flax or sheep's wool. Then it had to be woven on a heavy wooden loom, cut and sewn entirely by hand. In a world without mass production, everything was an exhausting marathon.
And the daily grind of farming wasn't any easier. Forget about neat, flat fields. You were out there hand-plowing ground absolutely filled with massive, rotting tree stumps that were just too hard to dig out. Every single member of the family, including kids as young as 5, endured this mind-numbing physical toll. You're weeding the 3 sisters' crops, corn, beans, and squash, milking temperamental cows by hand, and hauling endless, incredibly heavy buckets of water from streams just to wash dishes or cook.
But your experience in this harsh world depended heavily on where you fell in the social hierarchy. That's Section 4, Social Classes and City Life, the gentry versus the middling sort. It's a fascinating contrast. The wealthy gentry had access to imported Chinese tea, powdered wigs, feather beds, and actual glass windows. But remember, even with all that extreme wealth, they still didn't have central heating or indoor plumbing. Meanwhile, the middling sort, the middle class, they survived on immense technical skill.
People like blacksmiths worked incredibly long days in sweltering, white-hot forge conditions, all in practical, sturdy clothing, just to make the nails and horseshoes that kept the entire colony functioning.
In those crowded, foul-smelling cities, the local tavern was really the center of life. And because that well water we talked about was so heavily contaminated with waste, well, everybody drank alcohol. Even children drank small beer, which was a weak alcoholic drink less likely to carry disease than plain water. They drank cider or beer with literally every single meal, breakfast included. It wasn't a party, it was just a basic, necessary survival tactic.
As the days grow shorter, we hit Section 5, Medicine, Winter, and Survival, the deadliest season.
Winter was hands down the most fragile time for a colonist. If you got sick from the bitter cold, the cure was very often worse than the disease itself. Medical knowledge was incredibly primitive. Doctors believed in something called the four humors, meaning they thought illness was caused by your body fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, being out of balance. Their solution? To aggressively bleed you with a sharp lancet or violently purge your system. They frequently ended up killing weakened patients who honestly probably would have recovered if they'd just been left alone.
And this totally reframes how we look at history. When we picture George Washington's army at Valley Forge, we immediately think of men freezing to death in the snow. But think about the reality. A massive 67% of those deaths were actually from diseases like dysentery and typhoid. In a world with zero sterile conditions and no antibiotics, microscopic germs spreading through terrible sanitation were far deadlier than the freezing temperatures.
Because of this reality, death was a constant, unavoidable companion. Infant mortality was so devastatingly high that families often wouldn't even name a new baby for several months. It's heartbreaking, and the sheer volume of tiny headstones in colonial graveyards tells a truly tragic story. But interestingly, this also forced communities to become fiercely dependent on one another. You simply couldn't survive alone. You made it through mutual aid, like house raisings, shared harvest labors, and deep community bonds.
Which brings us to our final section, number 6, Forging the American Character, from hardship to revolution.
Let's look at how all this backbreaking labor, disease, and shared suffering built something far larger than a single settlement. Over generations, Britain began squeezing these fiercely self-reliant people with act after act, taxing everything from paper to imported tea. But the British government fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. They totally ignored the tough, independent culture these colonists had literally bled into the rocky soil to create.
So when you hear no taxation without representation, remember, it wasn't just about money. It was the absolute boiling point. These were people who had survived wattle and daub houses, smallpox, freezing winters, and endless physical labor. They looked across the ocean and realized, you know what? We simply don't need a distant king to govern our survival. We're already surviving entirely on our own.
And this is exactly why they were able to win their independence. The very same agonizing chores and harsh conditions that made colonial life a nightmare had, completely in secret, forged the ultimate fighting force. They were Minutemen. They were already masters of firearms from hunting. They already knew how to endure starvation and freezing weather. And when British imports were boycotted, the women just naturally spun their own homespun cloth. The intense hardship literally created the perfect, resilient army.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a profound thought. The next time you turn on a hot shower, or casually grab fresh food from a refrigerator, or go to sleep on a soft mattress, ask yourself something. In gaining all this incredible modern luxury, have we lost a little bit of that gritty, extraordinary, independent resilience along the way? It's something to think about. Thanks for exploring this with me.